This is March 28th, 2006. Our oral history interviewee this morning is Bob Ward. I'm Charles Lundquist. We're delighted to have you with us this morning.
Thank you, Chuck. Good to be here.
Since this is a historical endeavor, let me ask you first to say a word about where you spent your youth, where you got educated, and how you became a reporter and a historian of the space program.
Well, all right. Be glad to. Thank you. I'm still being educated every day, I hope. I was born and raised in a Birmingham suburb of Homewood, sort of an urban Mayberry, and it was a very pleasant growing up in a middle-class family. I went to Edgewood Grammar School and Shades Valley High School. The grammar school still exists. The high school has been bulldozed. And loved math and science, I thought, and all my friends were going into engineering at that time, and engineers were much in demand, and I thought that's what I wanted to do. I also loved mechanical drawing, best of all, and so I enrolled in Auburn in mechanical engineering. Had zero interest in tinkering with cars or see how a clock works or anything, but I loved to put those lines down on paper and do the math. Well, in the course of 2 years, the bloom came off the rose, and I went from an A, I think, in analytical geometry to a near failure in calculus. So the Peter principle was alive and well, and I rose to my highest level of incompetence, and I didn't do all that well in physics. I aced every mechanical drawing course I took, but I decided this was not my work. It should not be my life's work, and took some aptitude tests, and also thought about my family background. My father was a newspaper executive on the business side, and my mother and my aunt and my uncle were all at newspapers, either on the business side or the editorial side. So the aptitude tests pointed in the direction of communications and English, in which I had always done pretty well. And so I transferred to that West Alabama University called Alabama at the Capstone, and enrolled in journalism. Auburn did not have a journalism degree program then, and so I went 2 years at Auburn, and in 2 more years finished in journalism with a minor in history at Alabama, and wrote for the school newspaper. Just fell in love with the journalism program, and knew I was on the right course. And I met and fell in love with a Huntsville girl at Alabama whose family had the Dennis Watercress Company here.
Oh, really?
And I thought, gosh, and Huntsville is the watercress capital of the world, so I'm about to marry the heiress to the watercress fortune, and I will never have to work again. It didn't work out that way, but we did marry. I took an interim job in Birmingham in public relations and advertising with Ingalls Industries, which included a tank works and shipbuilding at Pascagoula, Mississippi, and barge works in Decatur, and privately owned, quite an industrial conglomerate, and worked there almost a year and gained quite a bit of experience in an area that I had no intention of remaining. But then I applied to the Huntsville Times to continue courting my wife-to-be, and interviewed with Reese Amos, the longtime...
I remember him.
Do you? Very erudite,
yes.
Wonderful gentleman, editor-in-chief, and timing is everything. I've been so fortunate and lucky in life. He had a reporter who was inclined to abuse the grape.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
and was a police reporter who usually wrote himself up after he got out of the drunk tank on Sundays or Mondays. And so Mr. Amos was needing a young starter reporter, and he let the other gentleman go and hired me as a cub general assignment reporter. And I soon
What year was that?
yes, that was I graduated from Alabama in '56, the summer of '56, and this was March of '57. 1957 was a very momentous year.
It was indeed.
And not just because I joined the Huntsville Times, but before the year was out, I both started covering the police beat, the fire, the courts, the police, and it was a postgraduate education in life. I did that for 4 years. But also that year, I started being a correspondent in my first year at the paper to technical and trade publications in New York with Fairchild Publications, electronic news and metalworking news. There was so much news coming out of Redstone Arsenal and the Army missile agencies out there. And this both gave me, and I later worked for McGraw-Hill magazines in New York. There was just an abundance of material coming out of Redstone for someone willing to work a little extra and be able to afford the luxury of staying in the newspaper business, where one took a vow of poverty to enter that field. And
with your police reporting, did you report on the Dickerson trials?
No, I was a little too green and young to be allowed to do that. I monitored a little bit of that, and I kept in close touch with my colleagues who were covering that, and I saw these media superstars coming down from New York and elsewhere to cover that. That was a fascinating court-martial.
It was indeed.
And you obviously were there.
I was there. I had the interesting experience of being in the process of writing some testimony for Colonel Dickerson when two MPs with 45s showed up and relieved me of my writing.
Is that right?
Yeah.
They were playing hardball.
No, it was hardball.
In
You're
that
right.
case. Not everything that was the truth and that happened in that matter came out in the trial. Colonel Dickerson may or may not have been operating completely on his own in doing some sub rosa things to promote the Army's interest in the missile world as opposed to the Air Force. And he took it upon himself to do what he thought was good for the country, good for the Army, and he ended up getting his wrist slapped in the court-martial and sentenced to, assigned to duty in the Panama Canal.
Yeah, he was
zone.
director of locks at the Panama Canal.
And he was not demoted, as I recall.
No,
he was
suspended in rank.
Okay. Lieutenant colonel, was he?
Colonel, full colonel. He was in line to be a general. I diverted you from your...
Well, I will say this. I'll leap ahead and then we'll come back. But 10 years later, or thereabouts, I was a young reporter accompanying a group of Huntsville community leaders in their annual Chamber of Commerce trip, I think it was, aboard Army transport planes out. They'd go to various places, but often it was Fort Bliss, El Paso, White Sands, and other points. And Colonel Dickerson was assigned there on one particular... I went on several of these trips and reported back to the paper on what parts of them I could report on. And Colonel Dickerson, everyone just embraced him out there from Huntsville. They knew him, admired him, And he led us, a group of about 6 or 8 of us, one evening across the border to Juarez, and we did a cultural sightseeing tour, and he was just a gracious host. And so very sadly, within the year, I think, he died in a tragic auto accident in Mexico.
Yes.
I think he was with his wife and possibly children, and I'm not sure if there were other fatalities in that, but he died. It was very good for me to get a chance to meet him, since I really had not met him earlier.
Just as an aside, the archives here at UH have a number of papers on his court-martial.
Oh, is that right?
Quite a collection of materials.
Good. That's good to know. It was an intriguing story on the national stage there.
But I diverted you from your account of your career.
Well, that showed me early on, and that happened, I think, the same spring I arrived.
Would have been about the time you arrived.
That was an early clue to me that this was going to be a very big, outsized town for news production, and that's what I was.
That's what you were there for.
And so that showed me early on that things are happening here and will continue. And then, as everyone knows, in early October of that same year, of '57, and some of our people at Redstone Arsenal, the German rocket engineers and scientists, knew full well what was coming and about when it was coming through their intelligence sources. And I understand General Medeiros, the commanding general, and certain others were very dubious about that, and or the timing of it. Anyway, the Soviets put up mankind's first space satellite into Earth orbit, and just shocked the nation and alarmed the nation, and threw so much of our society into question, our educational system, and our it was even a threat to defense, because the same rockets that could put up satellites could hurl atomic weapons,
yes,
as they were called then, not nuclear weapons, I don't think, at us. So there was great consternation. It also showed me, in a more parochial way, that here is an arena that Huntsville is going to play a big part in, because it soon came out that the Werner von Braun team and their enlarged team of scientists and engineers and others were prepared to have done that before the Soviets did. And this just incontrovertible evidence that they could have done that. But they were quashed and squelched by the Eisenhower administration that were trying to keep a military flavor away from this first space venture, and do it in a very scientific, step-by-step way, with really the Navy in charge. That's sort of military to me. But,
yeah, that's, Navy's still military.
Right, right. But during the International Geophysical year of '56, '57, I think, and the Russians had announced that they were going to, and we had announced we were going to put up a satellite. They just beat us to the punch in a very dramatic way. I went on to do, well, with the left hand, I was doing this, what we call stringing work. It's moonlighting work in my spare time, and after work, and in the evenings and weekends as I could, and some vacation time, and gaining experience and increasing my income with my young, growing family. We had 3 children within the first 6 or 7 years of our marriage, and at the Huntsville Times, I was keeping an eye on the space program, of course, but I did the police beat for 4 years. I covered county government for a couple of years. I did 1 year of work on the wire news desk to give me, as a writer, a reporter, the editor's perspective that deadlines were important, and there were some things that had to happen after the reporter turned in his story at the very last minute in order to get the paper out on time, which the readers were expecting. So it gave me a good object lesson about filing my copy in a timely way. In about 1962, the paper decided to create, for the first time, a full-time Redstone Arsenal beat, is what it amounted to, both defense and space. By then, the Project Apollo goal had been, the challenge had been announced by Kennedy, and Congress had embraced it. NASA had been created as the nation's civilian space agency. Pardon me. And I think that's the first thing I really raised my hand for at the paper. I want that. And I was lucky enough to get that assignment, which I did for 4 or 5 years through the heyday, the glory years of Project Apollo. We're going to land men on the moon before the end of the 1960s and bring them home safely. And there was a great sense of national commitment. At least it was felt that way in Huntsville. And my new job allowed me to travel all over the country and get the sense of that commitment there too. But to Seattle, to California and the contractor plants and other NASA centers in California and Houston and Washington, and to go down to Cape Canaveral and cover, I lost count of the launches I covered, manned and unmanned, and and I was meeting these high-powered scientists and the astronauts right and left, and it couldn't have been a more exciting time for a young journalist. And I just ate it up. And by 67, I had co-authored my first book, and it was a spin-off from this Fairchild publication, correspondence work I was doing from Huntsville. They had a books division, and they put together in 66 and published in, they planned it in 66 and published it in 1967, 2 years before the ultimate goal of Project Apollo, a book called Where Do We Go from the Moon? So it was a forward-looking, futuristic treatment of that subject well before we tried a manned landing on the moon. And I wrote, they asked me to do 10,000 words on future propulsion. So I interviewed Dr. Stuhlinger and read a lot of speeches and papers and gave them 12,500 words, and they didn't cut a word. So I was one of 4 or 5 authors asked to do different chunks of this book, and that was in New York, and it did pretty well. And a lot of that writing was not too far off. I included things like electrical or ion rocket propulsion, and that has come into being.
Yeah, that's now being used.
Exactly. One mission I think a planetary mission that was to be launched this year has been postponed a bit, just for budgetary reasons. The technology has really come along. Dr. Stuhlinger was and is a world authority on ion propulsion, and just received quite a an international medal up at Princeton a few months ago. And not only was he one of the recipients at Princeton, his likeness and name are on the medal. He is one of 4 honorees after whom the medal is named. The others being these space and rocketry lightweights like Russia's Tsiolkovsky and America's Robert Goddard and Germany's Professor Oberth, right, who was von Braun's first mentor and inspiration when von Braun was just in his teens, of course, and embraced his lifelong passion, at about age 14 or 15 or something.
Did you meet Oberth when he was here?
I didn't meet him here, but on the morning of the launch of Apollo 11 at the Cape, now, I was off the space beat by then and I'd been dragged into management at the paper as Sunday editor. Well, I assigned myself to go down to the Cape.
Well, obvious thing to do.
Right. We had a full-time space reporter who was doing a good job, but I went down to help do some color coverage and little sidebars, as we call them, secondary and tertiary stories. And I bumped into Dr. von Braun that morning before the launch, and our paths just crossed. I think Walter Cronkite, the dean of the TV anchors and a great fan of the space program, had just interviewed him in some trailer at the press site. This was mostly an open-air site with a lot of grass around and open bleachers, grandstand-type bleachers where the reporters worked. Unless you were with television, then you had a hermetically sealed trailer. And I was going someplace around the press site, and von Braun and I crossed paths, and everything had been said. I just stuck out my hand and wished him good luck, and he thanked me, and we shook hands, and he went back to launch control.
And Oberth was with him then, or?
No, I digress, which will be on my epitaph, my tombstone, I think. But I digress. After the launch, I was up in the stands typing my story, and I saw walking again at the press site on this grass Dr. Oberth. I recognized him, never met him, and he was Ernst Stuhlinger. Dr. Stuhlinger had him in tow. Probably they had come from a television interview or something. And I ran as fast as I could after them and caught up to them and nodded to Professor Oberth and asked Ernst, whom I fortunately knew, if Dr. Oberth would allow it, and if Ernst would translate, could I interview Professor Oberth? And they were both very gracious, and I did so. And he gave me some great quotes that this was the culmination of a dream he had had at beginning about age 11, and it was even more marvelous than he ever imagined. And I asked him about going to Mars now and what his projection was for that, and I remember he said we could make it in the late 70s if we did a crash program, but if we did it more incrementally and in a first-class way, we could make it in the early 80s. But that was my encounter with him. He was I think he was about 75 at that point, and I believe Dr. von Braun and NASA arranged to bring him from Europe to the Cape for that occasion, which was just so poetically just that he be there, because he had envisioned these and many other things happening. And what you alluded to, he did work in Huntsville. It was either in the late 50s.
Yeah, late 50s into the early 60s.
For a year or more under contract.
Yeah, I was in a bullpen office with him for quite a while.
Is that right?
In fact, my desk was next to his.
I understand his security clearance, because of the circumstances of his being a foreign visitor, was such that he couldn't even gain clearance to access his own papers that he had written. But I think people worked around that.
Yeah,
he managed.
It was never a serious problem.
Right. So my little story on the Oberth interview wound up on page 1, in a nice secondary position to the man leaves Earth for the moon lead story. So that was sheer luck, and I may have been the only reporter there who recognized Oberth. But coming from Huntsville, you do that sort of thing.
So by then you were, though, in a editorial position.
Yes, I was, and in about I did that. I was Sunday editor for about 4 years and put together all the section fronts that were special pages for the Sun, and then the special inside pages that we had on Sunday only. Mm-hmm. And then in 1970, I did have the honor, and I guess it was a point of pride, even after I left the space beat, I wrote about space every year for the Huntsville Times, in addition to this corresponding work I was doing. And I don't mean just one story. I would do an editorial or a feature story or a Sunday story with a space angle.
There were things happening in space to write about.
Yes, and there was more happening than one staffer specializing in that could do, and I just didn't want to let it go. But it was legitimate news and features. And in 1970, I was invited to become co-editor and co-writer of the editorial page with a wonderful older gentleman named Jim Hutzel, University of Missouri, journalism graduate and a master journalist and editorialist. So I learned for 4 years a lot from him, and continued writing about space on the editorial page, which works very well in Rocket City, USA. And at the end of, and then 74, they decided to create the new job of managing editor. They had an editor who by then was editor and publisher, Leroy Sims.
I knew him.
Did you? Wonderful gentleman, brilliant, South Alabama born, a scholar on the Civil War, or the War of Northern Aggression, as he called it. And he wasn't all that biased about it. I mean, he was a student of history, and and it was my luck, my great good fortune, that Mr. Sims and his first wife, who later died in Huntsville, were my family friends. They were close friends of my aunt and uncle. My uncle was a career Birmingham newspaperman, and Leroy was a career journalist, first for the Associated Press for 25 years, almost all in Birmingham, and then he was, as mandatory retirement approached, he had joined the Birmingham News as the managing editor, and was an outstanding leader and managing editor there. And my mother and father knew him well and socialized with him and his wife. And so where does he wind up? In Huntsville, Alabama, and here I am.
A second retirement or something for him?
Yes, it was. Well, both papers were and are owned by the Newhouse family empire, privately held family company based in Newark and New York, and the most outstanding people to work with. I was there 43 years. They never, ever dabbled in editorial or tinkered with editorial policy, and I just know that for a fact. They never hinted. In fact, they didn't want to talk about presidential endorsements and gubernatorial endorsements. On the news side, they just wanted us to be as good as we could, and they watched the bottom line. They watched what we spent, but they supported the pursuit of excellence, and at some cost. Of course, we felt it was a good investment, for a business investment for them too. But I'm not sure where I was headed with this, but they were very supportive of the news side, and they brought, when we had the rapid deaths of two young editors at the Times in their 30s. Will Mickle was the editor-in-chief and died suddenly at the YMCA, exercising. He was built like this ox, just a perfect physical fitness specimen, and he had a stroke or heart attack at age 33. And apparently he'd had rheumatic fever as a child. And then his successor was Alex Thomas. Alex was not all that much of a physical specimen, but he was in his 30s, and at age 39, he suffered a fatal heart attack. He had had heart trouble. And, of course, I and my peers are left to wonder on the editorial staff, what sort of business have we gotten ourselves into?
Yes.
This is a killer industry. And it was not funny. And they brought Mr. Sims up to be the editor after that. He just had such a strong constitution and great health. And he figured he was going to be there a while. And he was the editor, and then later he became publisher. When Jack Langhorne, our publisher, died, Mr. Sims was editor and publisher long into his 80s. And here I am. He's like in a way, I'm like the son he never had, and he knew all these roots of mine, and I worked my butt off for him and that newspaper. But
that was as managing editor.
And then, yes, and as reporter, and a junior editor under him. But I think he helped see to it that when they decided to create a managing editorship, that I got it. And I was age 40 then, and I was ready for it. The legs are beginning to go a little bit, as a reporter. And but it took me about...
chase people across the grass quite so fast anymore.
Yes, exactly. And so it took me about that late in life to really embrace management and see that I could help some of the younger staffers along and maybe accomplish some things, not just at the typewriter as it was then. We pretty soon went into computers. But the management of that newspaper, and I continued to write about space in managing editor, I was managing editor for 19 years. Pat McCauley was our executive editor that whole time. Mr. Sims was our editor and publisher that whole time. Everybody just stayed in place for decades, and as I said, I continued to write. I certainly had my hands full managing staff and directing the news operation. I was kind of the operations manager of the news department, and we got up to about 80 people strong in the news department. We had bureaus in all the surrounding counties, and our circulation was at an all-time peak. And Mr. McCauley, who's still with us.
Yeah, I know him well.
Yeah, you know Pat well. And Louisiana native and a scholar. I think he's that close to getting his PhD in political science, and he never went that last little step. But he's brilliant, and he was the editorial executive editor and officer, and let me do more of the hands-on day-to-day operations. So I traveled a lot as managing editor to editors' conventions. Often to Europe, often to Asia. I was fortunate enough to be one of 3 editors in the United States who got invited by the State Department's Foreign Press Office to visit and tour China for the better part of a month in 1980, fairly soon after the Cultural Revolution ended over there and such things were possible. But this was a bilateral, formal exchange of journalists. And the Chinese said they didn't want editors from the axis of the Los Angeles, Washington, New York axis. They wanted editors from the provinces, from the hinterlands. So they picked a guy from Alabama and the editor of the Portland Oregonian newspaper, another Newhouse newspaper, and whom I knew this fellow, Dick Noakes, and then a man named Reynolds from Missoula, Montana. So
that is the internet.
We were in the hinterlands, and we had we went through Hong Kong and then spent more than 3 weeks touring and interviewing the mainland. We were able to shape our itinerary somewhat, just to be not antagonistic, but just to be a little assertive. We asked to see defense establishments. I asked to see something related to their rocket or missile program, and we asked to see the churches. We understood even the Christian churches beginning to open in the metropolitan areas like Shanghai and Beijing, and they showed us mostly Buddhist temples. That was the church, but we saw a Catholic cathedral in Shanghai that was, and attended some services there, or went during worship services. Their fulfillment of my request to see something related to missile program, rocket program, came. We were visiting, it's like a YMCA in Shanghai, sort of probably the young communist pioneers or whatever they were called, and they had their little, it's like scouting. It was a mixture of scouting and YMCA, and our den mother and ground tour leader. He was a foreign affairs editor with the People's Daily in Beijing. He led us all over China, and we were at this place, and he came and grabbed me by the arm or shoulder and said, "Bob, come with me." He said, "You wanted to see rockets and missiles. Come with me." So we go into another room in this YMCA center, and there's a big cabinet of rocket models that these kids had put together. He said, "I told you I would show you China rockets." So I put that in as an anecdote in a later book of space humor I had written. But we had a wonderful tour, and Mr. Sims nudged me also during the late 70s and 80s into activity with the Chamber of Commerce, which was a little tricky for a managing editor to do. my first loyalties are to the newspaper and our readers. And he was phasing out of activity with the chamber, and certain other executives at the paper really didn't have a taste for that. And I thought, well, I'd been the business editor at one point and made a lot of contacts in the business and industrial community, and thought, well, if Mr. Sims wants me to do it, I'm going to do it. I just had an understanding with the chamber leadership that if one of my reporters comes in from the courthouse and he's heard about this industry announcement we are sitting on at the chamber, and I'm taken in confidence, I'm going to give you a telephone call, and all bets are off, and you're going to have to trust me. And we're going to put it in the paper. We're not going to read about it in the Birmingham Post-Herald or something. We'll see it on television. So we had that arrangement, and they were able to live with that, and we did kind of break the news on some industries. When that happened, I violated that only once. I knew all about the big Boeing announcement. They were going out to the airport and buying all this land. The government was coming up. It was going to be a huge groundbreaking, and that was so big for the community and the HIEC and the chamber and all of that. I said, well, it was only a day away, or 2 days at most. I said, all right, our reporters know about it, but I'm going to have them sit on it. And we did, and the Post-Herald beat us to the story the next day. So anyway, I guess there was some feeling, although not realistic, that it might jeopardize the project. Of course, that's what everybody was blowing in my ear. That was a crock.
That far along, and you couldn't have changed it with a bulldozer.
Exactly, but I acquiesced that one time. But anyway, and then I wrote several more books over the years.
Now, tell us about your books. You mentioned the first one. What were your later ones?
Yes.
Of course, I know your most recent, and we'll get to that.
All right. That first one was in '67, and as I said, co-authored that. I spent the next 3 or 4 years. As the moon landings approached, I thought. And I was struck by Art Linkletter's books about kids say the darndest things, and they were just best-selling books, just full of lines from his interviewing children on television, real popular show. And I said, astronauts say the darndest things, and space scientists say the darndest things, and politicians say the darndest things about space. So I started compiling and interviewing and collecting space humor, not jokes, but practical jokes the astronauts would pull on each other and other people, and witticisms by Von Braun, and on and on and on. And the first publisher in New York I sent this to, and I picked out a paperback publisher. I thought, this is not going to be any 800-page tome by a big hardback publisher. Was Fawcett Gold Medal Paperbacks, and they accepted the manuscript instantly. I wish they had edited or organized it a little better. I sent it to them thinking they were going to organize it better, and they just threw it in the print shop. And it was called A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon. And Bart Slattery, Dr. Von Braun's public affairs chief,
I knew him.
Carried out a request of mine. Bart, do you think Dr. Von Braun would do just a little introduction or foreword to that? So he did. I've had the greatest forewords to my books. They're much better than the books. But Dr. Von Braun did that, and 2 years, that came out in December '69, January of '70, right after the Apollo 11 and 12 successful missions. And a couple of years later, I decided Dr. Von Braun, all by himself, could fill a book with his wit and wisdom, or his humor and humanity. And so while trying to get a U.S. publisher, I also approached, the publisher visited Huntsville and heard about my book. That was the next step. Heard about the funny thing happened on the way to the moon, and took me to Happy Hour here. His name was Otto Wolfgang Bechler, and he was the principal of Bechler Verlag, big publisher. And he also was a personal friend of Dr. Von Braun's. So he taught me to drink Boilermakers out at the old Sheraton, and which I think is beer and vodka mixed in some way. And the more drinks he had him bring me, the lower my royalty percentage dropped, I think. But he
negotiated well.
He negotiated well. We executed a contract on the spot, and that came out in about 71. And then,
what was the title of it?
It was in German. It was Kosmisches. No, Komisches, Kosmisches. It translated Cosmic Comics.
Okay.
And my German is not good at all. And since I had that connection, I said, "What about a Von Braun anecdotage?" And he said, "Sounds good to me." So a year or so later, he published that, and it never found a U.S. publisher. So I went on to other things. And in '82. Well, I started in 78 with the shuttle approaching, and I said, I'm going to go back and do that space anecdotage, a funny thing happened on the way to the moon, do a sequel to it, and really do it right this time, and organize it into chapters. And I spent 4 years part-time, and that was published by a regional publisher. Expressly, it turned out, in '82 for the U.S. Space and Rocket Center. They had won the franchise from the U.S. government to host and run the United States Pavilion at the Knoxville World's Fair in 1982. And they had a space theme, and they wanted space-themed objects, items to sell at the pavilion, and especially something that could have a stamp of the World's Fair on it. So Ed Buckby, the executive director, knew that I had finished this manuscript and was beginning to shop it around, and he said, "If you can have us X thousands of copies by July the 4th, and this was like April or May. We'll sign a contract to guaranteed purchase of a large number of books, in which we can also sell at the Space and Rocket Center." And so I just put together a publishing package with a Nashville printer and binder and artists doing this and typesetting people and what have you. And we made it by July the 4th and called it The Light Stuff, a ripoff of Tom, what's his name? The Right Stuff, Wolf.
Yeah.
Tom Wolf. And The Right Stuff, his story of the first astronauts and Project Mercury and everything. And I later talked to him about that. He said, "That's fine, man." He said, "It's not going to cost me anything." So I called it The Light Stuff, Space Humor from Sputnik to Shuttle. And to back up just a minute, Professor Oberth did the foreword or introduction to my Von Braun German book. Walter Cronkite did the introduction. I mean, I approached him and he wound up doing it. It was so gracious, this The Light Stuff book. And then I spent a lot of time very busy being managing editor and and later editor of the paper. I was editor for 1 year of the paper, and some health problems intervened, and I sort of stepped away to the front office and became our publisher's sort of personal assistant in the community.
Well, we need to get on to your last book before we get away.
Yes.
Which has been a tremendous success.
Well, I just felt, thank you. I felt very fortunate and pleased about that.
How long did you work on it? How did it come about?
I was working on a book, and I hope to get back to it. I am getting back to it. A historical biography of Milton Cummings, who is the namesake of Cummings Research Park, and who had his own space connections with Teledyne Brown Engineering. Strong connections, but a cotton broker, trader by trade. And but in '98, after 9 years of part-time research on Milton Cummings, I said, no, I've got to do a book on Dr. Von Braun. That's another piece of unfinished business. I had that little German edition. But I said, we're losing too many of his contemporaries who haven't adequately told their stories and given their insights. And although many books have been written about Dr. Von Braun, they tended to be at one extreme or the other. They were very adoring and worshipful, or they were very nasty hatchet jobs, just character assassinations by so-called historians who were factoring in a lot of bias and prejudice. I don't mind saying it. And a lot of people acknowledge that these are not objective biographies or histories of the Von Braun team. So, and the third reason was that the man he had such a strong human side to him. He was such a well-rounded Renaissance man, and such a man of great humor and good cheer, along with this technical brilliance and this great breadth of technical and scientific understanding. Some others may have beaten him in the depth of knowledge in a certain discipline, but he was such a Renaissance man. And I mean, here's this passionate and quite skilled pilot and scuba diver and joke teller and a world-class cusser in several languages, and lover of learning in religion and geology and and astronomy. You just keep naming the subjects. He wanted to know everything in the universe. And so I set out in 1998, and I thought this will take a couple of years. It took 7 years, and the research just kept building on itself, and I had more than 100 interviews and did a lot of archival research, and first approached Smithsonian Books at the suggestion of a space historian friend who had books published there. They very quickly accepted the manuscript with enthusiasm, and they were going to call it Mr. Space, The Life of Wernher von Braun. We went through an excellent copy editing process. They advertised in a catalog prominently and sent out more than almost 100 review copies to major media around the country and major booksellers, all the big chains. And then they had cold feet, and political correctness intruded. And they, late in the game, wanted me to rewrite my 3 very detailed chapters on von Braun and Hitler's Nazi Germany. And I said, in effect, I don't think I can do that. Oh, and they threw up at me 2, as examples for me to emulate, 2 said hatchet jobs on von Braun that had been published in the 90s. By now it's 2003, or 4. They were going to publish it in June of 2004. And I said, let me just beef up those chapters with even more factual detail and see if this will make you happy. They had sent me manuscript page markups with a lot of snide and sarcastic remarks, just hand scrawl, very unprofessional, and whole paragraphs and pages X'd out where there was anything slightly sympathetic to Von Braun or positive or even neutral in some cases. All the negative stuff I had in there.
Disappointed that the Smithsonian would do that.
I was just heartsick, and anything negative in there, and I had all that my conscience would, and anything that as a journalist, I said, this has got to go in there.
Sure.
Some of his friends won't like this, but it's got to go in there.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm trying to do a balanced, even-handed book, and now Smithsonian doesn't want that. So they didn't say anything about my rewrites of those chapters, and I thought strengthening until a phone call in May. The book's supposed to come out in June. I had this feeling it ain't going to come out. And a telephone call from a junior editor I was working with said, we're canceling your book now. I said, why? He said, well, we don't have to give you any reason. I said, I've got a contract, and you've paid me money, and you've told the world we're not going to publish it. And he said, check clause 15B in your contract with us, which I had for almost a year. We have an escape clause. We don't have to give any reason. I demanded to speak with, and did speak with, the director who had come from sort of the entertainment publishing business in New York. He was connected with Warner, and he'd been there a year or two to try to turn them around financially. They'd made a lot of bum editorial decisions on titles to publish, too much esoteric stuff, and the sales went nowhere. Mine was part of their initiative to do trade books as opposed to truly scholarly academic books, but maybe more popular books. But certain people inside the Smithsonian organization and outside, and now that means maybe members of Congress or whatever, got to them, and the director, I had a 45-minute conversation with him, which I taped, and he kept giving me flimsy reasons they were not publishing. I said, Mr. Fair, would you tell me the real reason you're dropping this book? He said, Smithsonian is reconsidering its position on the Von Braun legacy, unquote. Aha. And this is the same Smithsonian that awarded Dr. Von Braun this coveted Langley gold medal that only the Wright brothers and Goddard and Alan Shepard and John Glenn and just a handful of others, and you honored him, and this is the same. He said, yes, this is the same Smithsonian that continues to hold the annual Werner von Braun Memorial Lecture and Prize. Yes, but such things are subject to change. I said, well, okay, goodbye.
So you found another publisher.
But I will say this because he was prophetic, and it was nice of him to say this. He said, look, this is a good book. You will find a publisher. It just won't be us. So it was politics. And the editor who had given me the bad news sort of leaked word, or it was very intentional so that perhaps it would deflect my contemplated lawsuit against them. He said, if you will contact Mark Gatlin, whom you used to know as a Smithsonian editor, Mark is now the director of the Naval Institute Press, and we believe that he would welcome hearing from you. Well, I did, and within 3 months, the Naval Institute Press accepted my manuscript. They've been wonderful to work with.
They
changed the title to Dr. Space. They really wanted, the Mr. Space had gotten so much publicity, they wanted to capitalize on that. They didn't change one word of my Nazi era chapters. They were quite pleased with the balance that I took. They called it Dr. Space. In the meantime, I'd gotten, well, even with Smithsonian, John Glenn, whom I'd interviewed for the book, and I also said, oh, by the way, would you mind doing a foreword or introduction? And he and Von Braun were fast friends for many, many years. And so he did a wonderful introduction or foreword to it. The book came out in May/June of 2005. It instantly was reviewed by one of the major reviewers they had sent copies to, the Wall Street Journal, and they gave it a very positive quarter-page review, and sales just took off. And we quickly went to a second printing, a third printing, a fourth printing has just happened, and the NIP is acting as our literary agent, since I don't have a literary agent, and they published in February a United Kingdom edition, and in 5 weeks it sold 2/3 of its rather modest hardback first print run, and they tell me they're going to have to be cranking up the presses again. It's really selling well over there, and I'm being invited to write magazine pieces in England, and NASA headquarters has embraced my book as a part of, under Administrator Michael Griffin, there is this strong resurgence of interest in the mystique of the Project Apollo and the Von Braun glory years, and Dr. Griffin is trying to rekindle that spirit and recapture that pursuit. I mean, these incredibly high standards of excellence and technical achievement that they had back then.
More power to it.
And
we can do it.
They've got me writing the Rainbow because of this book, and they think it captures part of that. And so earlier this month, I was invited to NASA headquarters area to a 3-day knowledge sharing, leadership, management, development, 3-day masters forum to talk an hour and a half about Dr. Von Braun and the lessons to be learned from him and his team. And as soon as I gave my talk, they chased me to the elevator. This is immodest of me to say this, but I think I contrasted with some of the drier presentations. Yeah. I had a lot of humor, Von Braun's humor, and a lot of humanity, his humanity, in my talk. And they called me at the elevator and said, "You saw the great feedback. We had to cut off Q&A. Would you give the same talk in September? And we're going to repeat this conference with a whole different set of NASA program and project managers and project engineers, 60 or 70 very selected invitees, and in Boston, and come and stay for the whole thing, you know, it was a nice fee involved and all expenses paid, and I was able to take my wife at my expense. And so there's even a film project under negotiation, they tell me, in the final stages of negotiation with a name movie production company. These things often fall through, so I don't know if this is going to materialize, but
on that fine forward-looking note, maybe we're about at the end of our time, and we need to let you get away, but thank you so much for sharing all this history with us, and good luck to you in the future.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lundquist. Chuck, it's good to be with you. Bye.
You have time to get to your